US military forces have boarded another sanctioned oil tanker that fled the Caribbean early this year. The Pentagon released this footage of the ship being boarded in the Indian Ocean. The US Defence Department said the vessel had defied President Trump's so-called quarantine of sanctioned ships in the Caribbean. Now, the tanker was one of several that fled the Venezuelan coast in early January after the United States abducted the country's leader, Nicolas Maduro. Well, Maduro's kidnapping has left Venezuela at a crossroads, with people in the country divided over its future.
On the streets of Caracas, government-sponsored billboards demand that the US free jailed leader Nicolas Maduro. But the people of Venezuela are more worried about what their future will look like and whether their livelihoods will improve, with their government now answering to Washington.
Well, people are repressed. They want to express their opinions, to demonstrate, whether for or against. There's always uncertainty, and until that's cleared up, everything is on hold. Businesses, people, commerce, everything.
I'm very happy that they're giving him I don't know how many life sentences. Because of him, my children are out on the streets. And that's just one small example. If the US is doing what they say they're doing, then that's very good. I hope the economy improves. That's the main thing.
Maduro's political propaganda is still everywhere in Caracas, and he still has a hard core of loyal followers.
We demand that the US government return our president, Nicolas Maduro, to us.
He should be patient, resist, and the truth, which will come to light, is that the world police had no right to come here and kidnap him.
Though Caracas has returned to its normal rhythm and daily life since Maduro's capture, analysts say Venezuelans are still hoping for real change.
The reality of the matter is that there are enormous expectations. It seems that Venezuelans are finally trying to understand where we're headed. There are enormous expectations for political change towards democracy in Venezuela.
As hope and skepticism sit side by side, Venezuela's future remains very much unwritten.
And Christopher Sabatini is a Senior Research Fellow for Latin America, US and the Americas Programme at the Chatham House Foreign Affairs think tank. He joins us from London. Welcome to DW. What, if anything, has changed politically, socially in Venezuela since the US kidnapped Nicolas Maduro?
Well, very little has changed in terms of the apparatus of the government. What the U.S. essentially did was take Nicolas Maduro and his wife, remove him and send them both to a Brooklyn jail where they're awaiting a trial on charges of cocaine trafficking and weapons possession. The rest of the apparatus remains in place. The vice president under Nicolas Maduro, Delcy Rodriguez, simply became the interim president, and all the other cabinet members remain the same, including some of the most repressive elements of the Nicolas Maduro government. The Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello, is still actually in the ministry. The Defense Minister, Vladimir Pedrino Lopez, is also in the Defense Ministry. And the Attorney General, who has been responsible for the jailing of more than 1,000 political prisoners, some of whom have been released, is still the Attorney General. So very little has changed. The only exception is investment is starting to trickle into Venezuela. And that is injecting some liquidity into the economy. It's propping up the currency, which was at the brink of collapsing. But in the immediate terms, politically, very little has changed. Socially, there's some hope, but economically, it's going to be a long haul.
OK, so we have the US forcing Caracas to sign oil contracts with US companies. But what of regime change? What of the imposition of human rights and democracy and an end to political oppression? Beyond those oil interests, are we any clearer on US objectives in Venezuela?
No, we're really not, quite frankly. We saw Marco Rubio a few weeks ago testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He talked about three stages: stabilization and reconciliation, and then economic recovery, and then a transition to democracy. The latter one simply isn't in the discussion right now. We saw an interview with Jorge Rodriguez, who's the brother of the now interim president, Delcy Rodriguez. He's the president of the National Assembly. It was conducted by Newsmax, a very right-wing station. It was a softball interview. They didn't push him on anything, but it was noteworthy. He didn't mention anything about elections, wouldn't mention any of the names of the opposition party leaders in the interview, and actually, quite frankly, said, if the opposition can come back if they don't engage in violence. But what constituted violence is not clear. So, no,
Right.
There's no movement at all on democracy.
Okay, and so today we have the US military announcing that it's seized another tanker linked to Venezuela's attempts to move sanctioned oil abroad. Just how significant is this latest seizure, and what does it tell us about the state of Venezuela's oil industry?
Well, first of all, it tells us that under U.S. sanctions, Venezuela's oil industry had basically gone dark. It was relying on these pirate ships, often falsely flagged ships, to transport its oil to other markets, China, India, mostly. And so what Trump is trying to do is enforce U.S. sanctions on Venezuelan oil. That sanction in the past, there were 500 million barrels of oil that were seized by the Trump administration. Those were sold, and that money was deposited in a Qatari bank. And so far, about $300 million of it went to prop up or support and inject capital into the Venezuelan market. I assume the same will happen here. But what's curious about this is for many Europeans who are looking at this seizure of pirated oil, they're looking at Russia. Russia has been surviving on shadow fleets of oil carrying its oil outside the U.S., rather international sanctions. This has implications beyond Venezuela.
Right. Okay. That's Venezuela. Christopher Sabatini from Chatham House, do stay with us as we turn our attention and your expertise to Cuba. We'll take a look at this report and then come back to you. Because as the US tightens its grip on Cuba's oil supplies, the country's beginning to feel the adverse effects. Havana has warned that foreign airlines will no longer be able to refuel because of dwindling supplies. And some airlines have already suspended flights to and from the island. Meanwhile, the UN is warning of a humanitarian crisis.
The steps of the University of Havana are empty. Universities across Cuba are closed. School classes have been cut back and transport slashed. It's all part of the government's emergency measures to preserve dwindling fuel supplies.
These measures make me feel insecure about what will happen with my university semester. How will I be graded? And if the virtual teaching platform that we will have to use now will actually work? Many students live in remote villages with no electricity or internet connection.
With oil supplies in a US stranglehold, the country is grinding to a halt. Havana residents queue for hours for the few buses available to get to work. Taxi rates doubled overnight.
I can't go anywhere. I've got family in the countryside. I've got a trip to make and everything's been cancelled. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing. You're stuck here. And what's worse is the helplessness about what's going to happen. What's going to happen, the uncertainty.
Since the US blocked Venezuela's exports in December, Cuba can no longer rely on its ally for much-needed jet fuel. Without sufficient supplies to be able to refuel in Cuba, a growing number of airlines are cutting their flights to the island. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum condemned the continued US threats on Cuba.
You cannot strangle a people like this. It's very unfair, very unfair. So I'm calling for these sanctions to end and for support to be given to the people. Always.
Mexican ships are preparing to send hundreds of tons of humanitarian aid to Cuba. Sheinbaum is also considering how to send oil without being penalized by tariffs from Trump. If Cuba does not get access to oil soon, The UN says it is at risk of humanitarian collapse.
Well, Christopher Sabatini from Chatham House is still with us. Let's talk about Cuba then. It has no oil and no minerals. So what does President Trump want there?
This is really a pet project primarily of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's Cuban-American. Although his family didn't flee Fidel Castro, they migrated to the United States or immigrated to the United States before. But really, this is an effort to remake the hemisphere under the so-called Donroe Doctrine by their own branding, more aligned with U.S. interest. So for Marco Rubio, the idea is to bring the end of the Castro regime in Cuba. It's been in place now since 1959. For Donald Trump, it's a show of force and a show that he means business when it comes to Cuba. So it's ideological, but it's also part of a larger projection of U.S. geopolitical power in the hemisphere and globally.
OK, so end the Castro regime and replace it with what? Because is there a credible opposition there?
That's a good question, Phil. There isn't. More than 60 years of totalitarian government has crushed civil society. There's no really alternative political leadership. It's unclear what will happen first. And the truth is in this particular case, Marco Rubio and many Cuban Americans' view of how regime change will happen in Cuba is based on Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union in 1989 and 1990. But of course, the embargo has, and especially now with the cutoff of oil, has really crippled the state. It's left the country very poor. What we could see more than any regime change to legitimate leadership is actually a failed state. And we're already seeing it now. It's unclear whether the leadership within Cuba will yield to the Trump administration's demands that it step aside.
Despite that, though, we do know that the two governments are talking. We know that from the weekend, Havana said we're open to talks. I understand that discussions have begun. What can you tell us about them? What sort of level are they happening at? And what are they talking about?
We really don't know at what level they're happening. There were some rumors last week and over the weekend that the Trump administration was talking to Alejandro Castro, who's the son of Raul Castro. Supposedly that may not have been true. So we don't even know if they're meeting in person. Supposedly, and simply, quite frankly, by embargo law, the Trump administration should be demanding a set of conditions that were outlined in 1996 by the Cuba Democracy Act or Libertad Act. And those are credible steps to free and fair elections, the release of all political prisoners, and then freedom of expression and freedom of association. But those would basically kill the Cuban regime as it currently stands. It wouldn't survive. So I don't know how you begin negotiations when you're basically asking a regime to sign its death warrant in the midst of a humanitarian crisis.
So a quick word then about Russia and China, big Cuba backers. What sort of intervention, if any, are we expecting from them on America's back door?
Phil, I don't think they would necessarily weigh in for the first reason, as you said, it's on the U.S.'s back door. It's only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. They have some listening stations. They have some surveillance infrastructure in Cuba that allows them to listen in on the U.S. They also obviously have in-person spies in Florida. Occasionally, Russian subs and boats will dock. It isn't really that close a relationship. I don't think if the Donald Trump administration scores some form of regime change, whether it's just the removal of the leadership or full-on regime change, we would see China or Russia come to the defense of the Castro regime, quite simply because they would have to yield to, as you said, this is in the U.S.'s backyard. It wouldn't really be productive to spoil the broader relationship with the United States simply over Cuba.
OK, thanks for talking us through that so clearly, Christopher. Christopher Sabatini from Chatham House.